In this video, we're going to talk about the root cause of lateral pelvic tilt. We're going to use shoulder weakness as an example of one potential root cause so we can explain the universal principles of movement compensation. Then, at the end of this video, I'm going to give you a framework that you can use and apply to your own situation to fix any movement compensation, whether that's lateral pelvic tilt or anything else. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in. Lateral pelvic tilt is when one side of the pelvis hikes up relative to the other. And when this happens, the distance between the ribcage and the pelvis on one side gets shorter, and these muscles get stiffer, while the distance between the ribcage and the pelvis on the other side gets longer, which causes these to get tighter. And this asymmetry can often coincide with injury or pain, so if you're anything like me, it makes sense that you'd want to fix it. But here's the problem. Lateral pelvic tilt describes a position, but doesn't tell you exactly why you're in that position or what the root cause is. So, again, if you're anything like me, you go on YouTube and watch your favorite movement gurus to see what they say the root cause is. And then this is where it gets confusing. Some people will say that a lateral pelvic tilt is nothing more than a postural tendency. It's where your brain thinks you are in space. While others will say that lateral pelvic tilt is a compensation for a lack of hip internal rotation. And then others will say that a lateral pelvic tilt is glute medius weakness, not being able to support that side of the body. Now again, with all these different reasons, that's confusing enough. But what's even more confusing is that if you start to look for these issues, you might actually find them. And you might not just find one of them, but you might find all of them. You look at your posture, and yeah, you're shifting over this leg more, and that side's hiking up. Or you do your hip internal rotation measurements, and yeah, it's limited. Or you test the strength of that gluteus medius muscle, and yeah, it's weak. So which one of these is the root cause? Well, it turns out that for me, none of these were the root cause, and actually, it was left upper trap weakness. Now, we're going to cover how exactly this contributes to lateral pelvic tilt in just a second, but the big takeaway here is that there is not a root cause or the root cause. There is your specific root cause. And if you want to get changes that actually stick, you don't want to look at what someone says is the root cause, but instead, you want to figure out which one is true for you. Okay, so now we're going to cover how a weak shoulder could cause lateral pelvic tilt. What I want you to pay attention to isn't exactly the mechanics we're going to talk about here, but rather the universal principles of how the body compensates in the presence of weakness. All right, so again, this is a personal example. I had a sudden onset of shoulder weakness when I injured my neck on a gig playing upright bass. Right away, I had trouble lifting my arm up, and over time it became evident that the weakness was in my upper trapezius muscle on this left side. So that muscle goes from your head down to the top of your shoulder blade, and it's going to shrug your shoulder up as well as help support the arm and lift the shoulder girdle as you bring that arm overhead. Now, because I couldn't get that movement in the shoulder girdle, my body found another way to achieve a similar position. And again, because there was weakness here, instead of moving the shoulder girdle up, my body found a way to move the whole rib cage up instead. Now, it turns out the way that the body does this is by tightening the opposite side back muscles. So muscles like the QL and the erector spinae and the lats, all on the right side, started crunching down to pull this side of the rib cage down in order to lift the other side of the rib cage up. And like I said earlier, I started to hear about people explaining this in terms of posture, limited hip internal rotation, or a weak gluteus medius. And I obsessed over all of these methods, thinking that they'd help to resolve the posture. But then, after years, I assessed my whole body, and I found that this left upper trap was still weak. And then it hit me. I was compensating, getting into this position because of that underlying weakness. And when I started to work this muscle without the compensation, then the lateral pelvic tilt went away all on its own. Now, to do this, we can take those universal principles of compensation and simply flip them around to reverse engineer a solution. So in this case, Weakness of the upper trap with shrugging and lifting caused this side of the rib cage to lift up as a compensation. So to fix this, we simply have to prevent the lifting up, so prevent the compensation, and at the same time, train those movements that the upper trap actually does. So as an example here, what we could do is we could actually take this side of the rib cage and bring it down slightly, which is going to increase the distance between the rib cage and the pelvis on the side that's usually hiked. Then we're going to go into a lateral raise movement with a shrug of the shoulder, but make sure that we're not taking that whole rib cage and lifting it on this side. Because remember, lifting the rib cage on this side is what's shortening up this side and causing the hip hike or lateral tilt. So we stay down on that side, preventing the compensation, and then we work the involved muscle through lifting the arm and shoulder girdle. And when we do this, we literally reduce the need for the body to use that alternative strategy. Now, as we're doing this, what we don't want to do is we don't want to just go like this, because again, that's reinforcing the compensation that's already there. Now, another example of an exercise that uses a similar approach would be to do a shoulder shrug. So I've got a weight in this hand hanging down. I'm going to actually side bend slightly towards that side to oppose that normal compensation. Then, keeping that rib cage anchored, I'm going to shrug that shoulder girdle upward while not lifting up that rib cage as I would do in that normal compensation. And again, because I'm not using the muscles over here to lift that whole shoulder girdle and rib cage as a unit, I'm now taking away the need for my body to use that strategy that resulted in the lateral pelvic tilt in the first place. All right, so now let's go through a framework that you can apply to your own situation, whether that be lateral pelvic tilt or really anything else. This is going to come down to 3 key questions. Now, some of these might be a little bit harder to answer than others, so I'll try to give you my best guidance here. Number 1 is just going to be a historical question. So what pains or injuries have you had in the past? And I would say that 9 times out of 10, whatever weakness might be causing a compensation is usually going to correlate to some sort of previous pain or injury experience. So write down anything, even if it seems insignificant. Could be an old ankle sprain. Trust me, I've seen old injuries result in low-level weaknesses that your body compensates around, and then next thing you know, you work on that and everything else resolves. All right, so with that said, step 2 is going to be to identify weaknesses. Sometimes we can do that just by asking the question of what happened, but other times we need an assessment. There's a lot of different ways you can actually do the assessment. So you could have someone else assess you. So if that's something that you're interested in, link in the description. I have a number of coaches coming on who are going to help you to be able to do just that. And this takes all the guesswork out of it. But if you are going to do it on your own, you've got a couple of options. You can go muscle by muscle, and I'm actually going to be creating a product around this. So if you're interested in that product, go ahead and comment non-manual muscle testing or something else to indicate that you want that. It's going to be a step-by-step product that brings you through each muscle so you can understand exactly where you're weak. All right, and the last option here, and this will be especially good if the last one sounded kind of overwhelming, is to not look at things on a muscle by muscle basis, but instead look at it through the lens of movement and especially foundational movement skills. So there's really only so many ways that human beings move, and a lot of the compensations we have are actually pretty predictable. So I've taken that into account in my movement foundations programs and put together the key skills that usually expose those compensations and help to fix them. So inside there's mobility, strength, and coordination work, along with some breath work too, that are going to help to round out your movement options. If you go through each of those regions, you'll definitely find out which areas are a little bit underperforming. If you can work on those, usually the other compensations, often in different parts of the body, will just begin to resolve themselves. All right, step number 3 here, and this should be obvious, is to take that information that you have about the weaknesses and begin to construct a plan and or exercises that help you to address that. So as we talked about with the shoulder weakness, I knew that the trap was weak because I tested it with exercises, and then I knew that my compensation was my body doing a similar movement, but finding it in a different way. And so to solve that, I needed to strengthen the muscle that was weak while avoiding the compensation. Now, the other side to this is also going to be to progress this, as well as see how this compensation might be showing up in your other movements. So for example, if I'm doing something in the gym where I'm overhead pressing, I might also find that I have a tendency to lift that side of the rib cage instead of lifting that shoulder girdle up. And if I'm doing a deadlift, maybe because the bar will be uneven if this shoulder's too low, then I will tend to go back into that compensation. It's important to understand that these types of compensations aren't something that you always can or even want to avoid across the board. That's because some of the benefit of working your body even with some compensation can actually prepare you for how it's realistic for your body to move when stress increases. As an example, if I want to play the upright bass and I have persistent weakness in this upper trap, then I might have to compensate a little bit while I'm doing it. In a perfect world, I wouldn't have to, but that's just not the reality that we live in. So for me, it's important to understand not only how to try to strengthen this area without compensation, but also how to be able to move within compensation without accumulating injuries. Now that's something that takes a little bit more practice and care and skill. So if that's something you're interested in, go down below, apply for movement coaching. This is what we literally do for all of our clients dealing with asymmetries. We help them balance out working on the compensations themselves, as well as allowing some compensation when necessary to get the best possible training effect. All right, so that pretty much does it for this video. Make sure to like, comment down below with any questions, do all the algorithm things that help me to help more people, and let me know what kind of videos you want to hear me talk about in the future, whether that be a specific topic or a specific angle or whatever it might be. I'm here to provide value for you so that you can move and feel your best. All right, as always, thanks a lot for watching. Until next time, peace.